Welcome to this section of the course, which will be all about navigation. And as part of this section, we will take the starter project, which currently uses the Navigator 1.0 APIs, and convert it to use GoRouter, which is an official routing package that is now maintained by the Flutter core team. And the goals of this section are for you to learn about declarative routing, become familiar with the GoRouter APIs, and show you how to migrate an existing app from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter, so that you can also go through the same process with confidence in your own apps. And even if you're already familiar with GoRouter, chances are that you will learn a few tricks along the way. And these lessons will be particularly valuable because we already have an e-commerce project to start from, which already contains a number of different pages. And I think that this project is not too simple and not too complex either, making it ideal for trying out the various APIs that come with the GoRouter package. So we will start off by talking about Navigator 1.0 and its limitations, and how Navigator 2.0 solves these limitations, and why we are better off using GoRouter directly instead of Navigator 2.0. And then we'll install and configure GoRouter in our project, and we'll learn about its features, including how to work with routes and subroutes, and how to trigger navigation events from our widget using Go and Push, and learn about the GoRouter helper extension that makes routing easier, and also learn about routing with parameters, as well as error handling for non-existing routes. And overall, we'll cover all the most important GoRouter APIs. And I should mention that since we are still at the beginning of the course, there is still a lot of functionality that we haven't implemented in our e-commerce app. And while GoRouter offers some advanced features, such as the ability to redirect users to a different page if a certain condition is not met, we are not yet in a position where we can take advantage of those features. All that is to say that while we will explore most of the GoRouter APIs in this section, we'll get back to some of the advanced ones later on, when we'll have all the building blocks in place. Likewise, it is still a bit too early to talk about how we can write automated tests for our routing logic, and again, this is a topic that we will cover later on. In summary, the primary goal of this section is to help you become more confident about declarative routing in Flutter and teach you how to use GoRouter to implement declarative routing in your own apps. And we will see how to do all of this in the coming lessons. However, if you feel adventurous and want to try doing things on your own, you can try converting the starter project from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter by following the official documentation, and this is a great way to learn. Alright, so let's continue on the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to talk about Navigator 1.0 and its limitations, and explain some reasons why you may want to move away from it, and why GoRouter is a good alternative that offers many more capabilities that you may need in the future. So as a starting point, we have our e-commerce project, and throughout this section, we are going to use Google Chrome to test our app, because this will give us the ability to work with deep links and URLs on the browser address bar, which is a native feature on the web. So before continuing, make sure to select Google Chrome as a target and then run the project with it. And as you can see, you can already use this app to navigate between the different screens. But how is this done in the code? Well, an easy way to find out is to open the search panel, and then on the search bar over here, you can type Navigator of context. And this will reveal all the places in the code where navigation takes place. For example, if we open this line inside the shopping cart icon file, we can find the code that is used to navigate to the shopping cart. Or if we scroll down and open this line inside the products grid, then we find this code which shows the product screen inside a material page route. And in this case, we pass along the product ID that will be used inside the product screen, so that we can show different images and product information depending on which product we select. And of course, this is still a relatively small project, so if we want to find all the places where navigation takes place in our app, we can select this line that says Navigator of context.push, and then we can open the search panel to search all the instances of push inside our project. But this is not great, and it would be better if there was a single place where we could see all the routes at once. And this becomes more and more important if the app grows much larger in size. And this is the kind of problem that named routes sets out to solve. And the main idea here is that rather than having our widgets create the destination routes themselves, they should just specify a path to a new route that they want to get to. For example, consider this shopping cart icon file, where we can find this code that navigates to the shopping cart screen. And in this instance, it would be a lot nicer if we could just type navigator of context.pushNamed with the path to the named route that we want to take. And this is a lot more concise than having to type all these lines. And then, somewhere else in our app, we can declare a list of all the route names that are supported, along with the corresponding routes. And just to be clear, the reason why this is important is that when we push routes directly, like this, we are introducing a strong dependency between widgets that are unrelated. In fact, there isn't really a good reason why this widget should depend on the shopping cart screen. And instead, by using named routes like this, then all our widget needs to know is that there is a specific route name that it should navigate to. And as we will see, this allows us to centralize all the route definitions in one place, and that will make them much easier to manage as our application becomes bigger. And if you want to find out how this all works with the Navigator 1.0 APIs, then the Flutter documentation already has a simple step-by-step tutorial about this. However, named routes alone don't really offer all the routing capabilities that are needed for more complex projects on multiple platforms. For example, on Flutter Web, we may want to navigate to a certain route by entering the corresponding URL on the address bar. And to show you what I mean, here is the completed e-commerce app that we will build by the end of this course. And as you can see, here I can manually change the URL to point to an existing route, and this will take me to the corresponding page. And if I happen to enter a URL to a page that doesn't exist or I shouldn't have access to, then I get redirected to a 404 page. So routing by URL and redirections are features that are very common in today's web apps, but they are only available with the Flutter Routing API, which is also known as Navigator 2.0. And beyond that, the ability to use URLs for routing is at the basis of another important feature known as deep linking, which is important on web just as it is on mobile. And broadly speaking, deep linking is all about opening a URL that displays a specific screen in your app. And this can be very handy on e-commerce apps like this, because if I see a product that I like, I can just copy the URL and then I can send it to my friends and they can check it out by just opening the URL. Just like this. And another feature that is often needed is the ability to pass parameters when navigating to a new route, and these can be further distinguished between path parameters and query parameters. And any serious routing system should be able to handle both path and query parameters. And there are also some other concerns that we will discuss as we go forward. Okay, so let me just go quickly back to the code where I can undo the changes that we made earlier on. And to summarize, I would say that when you build your own Flutter apps, you should think about what features you may need now and in the future, and choose the most appropriate navigation system or package. And just to be clear, the Navigator 2.0 APIs that have been introduced back in 2020 will give you all the capabilities that you possibly need to build complex routing logic. However, using these APIs comes at a cost because they have been criticized for being too complex and hard to understand. And I tend to agree with this assessment because when I first built this e-commerce app, I migrated from Navigator 1.0 to 2.0. And while I could make Navigator 2.0 work, the resulting code was very error-prone and hard to maintain. And once I moved over to GoRouter, I managed to halve the amount of navigation code that I had in the project, and I've been much happier since. And of course, there are also other routing packages out there that do a great job at many of the same features that are supported by GoRouter. However, there are some very strong reasons why I can recommend GoRouter over all other routing packages. And these are that the API is minimal and very easy to use. And also the documentation is outstanding. And in fact, there's an entire website called gorouter.dev that covers this in great detail. And also, GoRouter is maintained directly by the Flutter team itself, which sets a very high bar for code quality. And ultimately, this makes it a good solution for both small and big Flutter apps. And while it's not feature complete as I record this lesson, chances are that all the most requested features will be implemented in the future. So the takeaway of this lesson is that if you're trying to decide which navigation package to use, you should probably go with GoRouter. So let's continue on the next lesson where we will start working with it. In this lesson, we're going to install GoRouter as a dependency and start using it in our app. And at this stage, I recommend that you open up gorouter.dev on your browser and keep it on the side so that you can use it as a reference as you make changes to your own code. And in case you need this again, I've also included the starter project in the resources for this lesson. And this is exactly the same as the one we have used in the previous section. Okay, so we can get back to VS Code, and here we can open the pubspec.yaml file. And the first thing that we should do is to add gorouter as a dependency. So to do that, we can open the command palette, and then we can type dart add dependency and select this option. And in here we can type go router and press enter. And this will add it for us. And as you may have noticed, I've just installed GoRouter version 5.0.1, which is the current version at the time I record this lesson. And all the upcoming lessons will be based on this version. And to make absolutely sure of this, I'm going to remove this caret from here. And this will tell Pub that I want exactly this version. And I recommend that you do the same as well and install version 5.0.1. And if there are any breaking changes in the future, I will let you know and update the code as needed. Okay, so as a next step, we can open the app.dart file. And what we want to do now is to use the new material app.router API. And we need to do this to opt in to use the new Flutter routing APIs, which are known as Navigator 2.0, because GoRouter is built on top of Navigator 2.0 and needs this. But as we can see, we now get an error telling us that the home parameter is no longer defined. And this is because the entire routing logic should be handled by a new argument called routerconfig, which we are going to set shortly. So for now, let me set this value to null, like this. And we can also remove the home argument that we are no longer going to use, like this. And if we hover over the routerconfig argument, we can reveal the documentation and learn that this is an object that is used to configure the underlying router. And the important thing to understand is that in order to get this code working, we had two options. The first one is to implement the routerconfig class ourselves, which basically means implementing all the Flutter navigation code by using the routing APIs. And as we have said, this is a whole world of pain. And the alternative is to use GoRouter instead. So let's do that. And the first thing that we need to do at the top of the build method is to declare a final GoRouter object equal to GoRouter, like this. And in order to use this, we need to import gorouter.dart. And this takes a list of routes which represent all the possible pages that we want to show in our app. So inside here, we can add a GoRoute object and give it a path argument, which in this case should be a /, which by convention represents the route path. And we should also provide a builder argument that we will use to return a widget class for this path. And this is a function that gives us a context along with a state object, and we can use this to return our product list screen widget. And of course, if we want to use this, we need to import it, like this. And if you remember, this is the same widget that we used to pass to the home of the material app. And now that we have this GoRouter object, we can update this line and pass it as an argument to the router config, just like this. So at this stage, we can select Chrome as a build target, and then we can run our app. This may take a little while, and once the build is complete, we should see the app running on Google Chrome over here. And as we can see, we can still navigate to any of the remaining pages. And this is possible because we can move from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter incrementally, one route at a time. And this is great, especially if you have a complex app and you don't want to migrate all the routing code in one go. And all we need to get started is to create a GoRouter object with at least one route inside it, and pass it to the router config argument of the material app. And of course, we're just getting started, and in the coming lessons, we'll convert this entire app to use GoRouter and explore some of its capabilities in more detail. For now, there is one thing that I want to change right away, and that is to remove this hash at the end of the URL, which is added by default when you run a Flutter app on web. And if we want to change this behavior, we need to customize the URL path strategy. And the GoRouter website has a page explaining how to do that. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see that this is just a single one-liner that we need to add to our main Dart file. So what we're going to do is to copy this code, and then we can get back to our project and open the main.dart file. And then we can paste it over here, right before our call to run app. And we can use the quick fix shortcut to import the GoRouter library, like this. And now we can hot restart. And once the hot restart has completed, we can see that the URL no longer has a hash in the end. Okay, so this is great progress. And before we move forward, there are a couple of small changes that I want to make to our GoRouter setup. So let's get back to our main app widget over here. And the first change that I want to make is to add an initial location argument, which is something that we can use to tell GoRouter what location to use when the app is first started. So in this case, we can just use a forward slash because we always want to start from here. But just be aware that this is something that you can configure if you want. And the other change that I want to make is to enable debugging inside GoRouter. And we can do that by adding a debug log diagnostics argument and set it to true. And what happens when we enable this is that all navigation events will be logged to the debug console. And there is a page on the GoRouter documentation that explains how this all works. So if we want to see how this looks like, we can open the debug console and then we can save and maybe even hot restart the application. And as you can see, as soon as the application starts, we get this console log that tells us about the routes that are available. And at the moment, we only have one, of course. But this list will grow over time as we add more routes in the next few lessons. So we'll keep an eye on this as we make progress. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to continue our migration from Nav 1.0 to GoRouter and see how to work with multiple routes. And one important thing to understand is that GoRouter has a declarative API, meaning that we can define all the routes we need inside a single GoRouter object. And in fact, we only need one GoRouter object for the entire application. And since we need to define all the routes inside it, I propose that we move this object into a separate file that will contain all the routing code. So at this stage, we can create a new folder inside source, and we can call this routing, like this. And then inside it, we can create a new file called approuter.dart, like this. And then we can get back to our app.dart file. And here we can select the entire GoRouter code. And then we can cut it. And then we can paste it inside the new file. And of course, in order for this to compile, we need to import GoRouter.dart, as well as the file that contains our product list screen widget, like this. And after we have saved this file, we can get back to the app.dart file. And then all we have to do is to select this line which contains an error, and we can just fix it by importing the new approuter.dart file, just like this. So all we have done here is to move the declaration of this GoRouter object into this new file where it is defined as a global variable. And one thing that you may wonder is whether this should be a global variable or whether it would be better to declare it in some other way and make it accessible to the rest of the app through some dependency injection system. And at this stage, I think it's best if we follow the KISS principle and keep things simple. Besides that, we only need one instance of this object, and the only place where it's ever used is as an argument to our material app over here. In fact, we will see that our widgets will never need to access this object directly. So it's really unnecessary to worry about dependency injection at this state, and a simple global variable will do just fine for now. With that said, we will revisit this choice later on. In fact, at some point, we will add some extra functionality to our app and add some dependencies that we will use to implement some redirection logic. But once again, this is good enough for now. Okay, so let's carry on, and our next goal is to add some new routes and learn how to use the GoRouter API to navigate to them. For example, we can see that from this page, there are a number of other pages that we can get to, such as the product page, as well as the shopping cart, and the orders page, and the account page as well. So we can choose any of these, and I think a good one to get started is the shopping cart. This means that our immediate goal is to define a new route for the shopping cart page, as well as navigate to it using the GoRouter API, rather than using navigator.push. So let's figure this out. And the simplest way for us to add a new route here is to copy and paste the existing route. And then we can change the path here to something like /cart, like this. And we also change the value returned by this builder to return a shopping cart screen, which is the widget that represents this page. And of course, in order to use this, we need to import it. And now that we have defined this route, we need to locate the code that is used to navigate to the shopping cart. So let's use the File Explorer to find this. And then we can open the Features folder and the Home App Bar folder, which is inside it. And as we can see, here we have a shopping cart icon widget. And the purpose of this widget is to show this icon with the number of items in the cart. And if we look at the build method, we can find out that when this icon is pressed, then we make this call to navigator of context.push in order to show the shopping cart screen as a full screen dialog. So let's see if we can figure out how to replace this code and use GoRouter instead. So what we can do is to comment out this entire block of code, and instead we can define the onPressed callback to return GoRouter, which we need to import, and then we can type of context like this, and then we can type go. And we can see that two methods are suggested, and these are called go and go named. And we'll talk about their differences shortly, but for now we are just going to use go, and we need to pass an argument that represents the location that we want to navigate to. And this location should match the path that we have defined over here. So we can copy /cart from here, and we can paste it in here like this. And then we can save this file, and we can see if our code works. And since we changed a few things, it's probably a good idea if we do a hot restart at this stage. Then we can get back to our app, and if we press on this button, we can see that we are taken to the shopping cart. However, the back button has disappeared, meaning that we no longer have a way to get back to the homepage. So this is not quite right. But on the plus side, we can see that the address bar now has a trailing cart at the end. And if we remove this and hit enter, then we are taken back to the homepage. Alright, so let's figure out how to fix our navigation. Once again, our main problem is that we don't have a back button when we move to the shopping cart. And if we get back to our approuter.dart, we can notice one thing, and that is that these two routes are actually siblings, meaning that they are both top-level routes that live inside this GoRouter object. However, does this really make sense? Should the shopping cart be a sibling of the main route, or should it be a sub-route that is defined with a parent and child relationship? And to answer that question, we need to understand that from the shopping cart, it should always be possible to navigate back to the homepage. And if we use GoRouter, this concept can be expressed by using sub-routes. So let's go ahead and modify this code. And what we want to do is to nest a new routes argument inside this GoRoute. So let's create an empty list over here. And then what we can do is to take this route and move it inside it like this. And now that we have saved and hot reloaded, we can see that we are actually getting a blank page over here. And if we open the debug console, we notice that we have an error about no media query widget ancestor found. And while this is not particularly helpful, we need to realize that over here we have just declared this path using a /. However, this is not the right thing to do when we define subroutes, and instead we should remove the / and just use cart instead. Because it is GoRouter's job to work out the complete path that leads to a certain URL by appending the individual paths that are found along the way. And in fact, if we add together this / and the cart string, we find exactly this location, which is what we have specified when we try to navigate. So at this stage, we should be able to save and hot reload. And as we can see, the shopping cart page now has a back button, and we can navigate to it and get back to the home page as we should. So while all we have done here is to enable navigation for just one page, we have already started to explore concepts such as sub-routes and how to do navigation using the GoRouter API rather than using navigator.push. So let's continue on the next lesson where we will explore things more in detail. In this lesson, we are going to continue exploring the GoRouter APIs. And one thing that we can notice is that the syntax that we have used over here is very similar to what we had before. Because rather than calling navigator of context, we use GoRouter of context instead. However, having to type GoRouter of context every time we want to go to a new route can become tedious. And instead there is a nicer way, and that is to just type context instead. And in fact, we can see that context.go is valid syntax. And this is possible because GoRouter introduces a build context extension. And we can explore this by going to the definition of this method. And as you can see, here we have a GoRouter helper extension on build context. And this defines useful methods such as go and go named and push named, as well as pop, making it easy to do routing like this. And to save ourselves some typing, we'll always use this extension going forward. And by the way, one important distinction that we need to be aware of is the difference between go and push. So for the time being, we'll use go because this is what we want in most cases. But later on in this section, you'll find a lesson that explains the difference between go and push in great detail. For now, we can carry on, and I want to point out one subtle detail, and that is that in the previous code that we have commented out, we were setting this full screen dialog argument to true, and this determines what kind of transition we get when we navigate to this page. And it seems that at the moment the shopping cart slides in from the right, which is not the behavior that we want. And instead, we want the shopping cart page to slide in from the bottom, which is what happens if we set full screen dialog to true. So how can we customize this? Well, let's get back to the approuter.dart. And as it turns out, we can't do this if we just use the builder argument. However, we can use a different argument called page builder. And this takes the same context and state argument that the builder takes. But for the return type, rather than returning a widget, we should return a material page instead. And in order to use this, we need to import material.dart. And then inside it, we need to specify a child widget, which is the page that we want to return. And because we are now using a material page, then we can pass full screen dialog equal true as an argument. And when we use GoRouter like this, it is also advisable to specify a key argument and provide state.pageKey as a value. And now that we have this page builder argument, we no longer need the previous builder. And if we save and open the shopping cart again, we can see that now the page slides in from the bottom and the close button icon has turned into a cross. So the key takeaway here is that whenever you're happy to use just the default transition when navigating to a new page, then all you need is a builder that returns the widget that you want. But if you want to customize this, for example, by setting full screen dialog to true, then you need to use the page builder argument instead and configure it like this. And if you want to learn more, you can open this page about migrating to GoRouter 2.5, and this contains an explanation about the difference between using page builder and builder. And down here at the bottom, there is also a custom page that shows you how you can add custom transitions when working with GoRouter. But as far as we are concerned, we are happy with what we have, and we can get back on track. And now that we have clarified this, we can get back to our shopping cart icon, and here we can remove the old code that we no longer need. And then we can continue on the next lesson. We are now ready to continue the migration of our app from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter, as this is a good way to practice using the new APIs that we have learned. And just like we have added the shopping cart as a sub route over here, we could do the same thing with the orders and account screens that we can see over here. So we can go ahead and create another 2 sub routes alongside this one. And the easiest way to do this is to copy this route, and then we can paste it 2 times like this. And then we can replace this path with orders, and we can replace this path with account like this. And of course, we need to replace the child widgets as well. And the widget that we want to use here is called orders list screen, which we need to import. And the widget that we want to use here is called account screen that we need to import as well. Then we can save this page, and then we need to locate the places in our code where we navigate to these screens. And as we can see, the buttons that we use to navigate to the orders and account screens belong to our custom app bar. So we can use the project finder to open the home app bar file, and then we can scroll down to our build method, and here we need to figure out where we need to make our changes. And as we can see, this build method retrieves the screen width from the media query and uses it inside this condition to return 2 different app bars depending on whether we are on a wide or narrow screen. In fact, if we try to resize this window, you can see that below a certain threshold, we just show the shopping cart icon with a pop-up menu next to it. But if we increase the window size, then we show the orders and account buttons directly in the app bar itself. So we need to make sure that we update all the navigation code in both scenarios. And the other thing that you can notice is that down here, we also have this condition that checks if the user is not null. And if this is true, then we add these two action buttons, and instead we show this other action if the user is null. And this user object is declared over here as a const variable to simulate the fact that we are currently signed in. And the idea here is that later on in this course, we'll deal with user authentication and how to enable sign in and sign out flows. But for now, none of this code is in place, and we have this to do here as a reminder. So for now, we always pretend to be signed in by hard coding this user object like this. So as far as we are concerned, our goal doesn't change, and we want to replace these calls to navigator.push with the GoRouter APIs. So let's do that, and here we can delete this code and replace it with context.go passing /orders as an argument, and of course we need to import GoRouter. Then we can copy this line and use it to replace these lines over here, and instead of orders we want to navigate to the account. And we can also do the same and copy this line and use it to replace these lines over here, and this time we want to go to the sign-in page like this. And now if we go back to our router code, we can see that we have declared the corresponding orders and account routes, but not the signing route. So let's add this as well by copying this go route and pasting it in here and passing sign in as the path. And then inside this child, we need to return an email password sign-in screen, which we need to import. And this takes a required form type argument, which is used to specify if we want to show the signing or register form. And for now, we can just pass email password signing from type.signing like this. And now that we have done this, we should be able to test this functionality. So we can save and hot reload. And as we can see, if we select the orders page, then the URL at the top updates accordingly. And the same happens if we choose the account page. And this proves that our code is working. And if we want, we can even test the routing for the sign-in page. And to do that, we can get back to the home app bar. And then at the top of the build method, we can set this user object to null like this. And this will ensure that this statement over here evaluates to false. And in fact, we can now see that the signing action button appears. And if we click on it, then we are redirected to the email signing page. So this proves that the sign-in screen works as well. Okay, so let's get back here and restore the previous code with a non-null app user. And then we can save and hot restart to get back to normal. And one thing that we forgot about is that if we resize this page, then the buttons over here disappear and they are replaced by these pop-up options instead. And these are all defined inside this More Menu Button class. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see that once again here we are using the Navigator 1.0 APIs. And what we want to do is to replace them with GoRouter instead. So let's quickly fix this, and we can replace this code with context.go with sign in like this. And of course, we need to import GoRouter as usual. And then we can copy this code and paste it in here and replace this with orders. And we can do the same here as well and replace this with account like this. And if we want, we can verify that this all works by selecting these options. And as we can see, the URL at the top is updated. So using GoRouter brings some advantages because our widgets no longer care about all the details used for routing, and instead they can just specify the target location, which can be expressed as a string literal. However, we can do even better than this and navigate by route name rather than by location, and we'll see how to do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to learn about routing by name, which is a useful GoRouter feature that can make our routing code more robust. So let's go back to our approuter.dart file. And the idea here is that for each of the routes that we have defined over here, we can give them a name in addition to the path. For example, we could call this home, like this. And this allows us to navigate to a specific route by name rather than using the full location like we do over here. And as we will see, this is particularly useful when dealing with routes that take parameters, making our code less error-prone. So for now, please just take my word for it that navigating by route name is better than navigating by path. And one nice thing that we can do at this stage is to define an enumeration that will contain all the possible routes that we are going to support. And as we are about to see, this will give us some additional type safety guarantees. So for now, let me undo this. And then we can go to the top, and here we can define an enum app route. And then inside it, we can define a set of values. And we're going to call these home, cart, orders, account, and sign in, like this. And then inside our Go router, we can find this Go route over here and add a name argument with a value of approute.home. But of course, this is an app route enumeration and we can't assign it to a string. But since that's 2.15, there is an easy way of getting the name of an enum, and this is exactly what we are going to use here. And we can also do the same thing for all the other remaining Go routes, like this. And we can do the same on the orders route, and the account route, and the signing route, like this. And then we can save this file, and then we can get back to the home app bar and find our code for navigation. And here we can replace this line with Go named, like this. And instead of using a string literal directly, we can type approuter.orders.name. And in order to use this, we need to import approuter.dart. And then we can do the same here and call Go named. And instead of hard coding the location, we can use approute.account.name. And we can do the same thing here as well. And as you can see, the advantage of doing this is that we get useful code suggestions, and that makes it a lot harder for us to make mistakes. So now that we have changed this code over here, we need to remember that we need to apply the same changes to our More menu button widget. So over here, rather than using context.go with signing, we can use this instead and import approuter. And we can also use Go named over here and over here as well. And once again, the benefit of this approach is that all these route names are now type safe, making it hard for us to make mistakes. And another important thing to mention is that sometimes you had to deal with deeply nested routes, like in this example. And if you use the Go API, then you need to be careful that each subroute is spelled out correctly. But if you use named routes, then you only need to pass the correct name, provided that you have defined it inside your enumeration. And another benefit of this approach is that if you want, you can change any of the paths inside this file without having to modify any of the routing code in your widget, because all the route names are encoded inside this enumeration. And hopefully you should now start to appreciate the elegance of the GoRouter APIs, because you can define your entire route hierarchy inside one file. And for each route, you can define a custom path, name, and page builder. And all you had to do in your widget is simply to call context.goNamed with the route name that you want to take. And GoRouter takes care of everything else for you. Okay, so before we move on, there is one more file that we still need to update, and that is the shopping cart icon file, which is used to show this widget inside the app bar. And as you can see, this code over here still uses context.go with a hard-coded string literal. So let's update this to call context.goNamed, like this. And here we can pass approute.cart.name instead. And of course, we need to import this. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson where we will learn about working with parameters. Now that we have covered the basics of routing with GoRouter, we are ready to look at some more interesting use cases. And one of them is about how we should handle the case where we open the product page. And this is an interesting case because we should always show the data that corresponds to the product that was selected. And if we take a look at how the product screen is implemented, we can open the product screen file. And inside this widget, we can see that the product ID is passed as an argument. And then inside the build method, we use this temporary code to find the product that matches with the given ID. And once a product is found, this is then used in the rest of the build method. And what is just as interesting is the code that we use to push this screen to the navigation stack. And this code lives inside a widget called product grid, which we can find over here. And as we can see inside the build method, we use this product layout grid, which is a widget that is responsible for showing all the product cards inside the grid. And this widget gives us an item builder that we can use to find the correct product for a given index. And then we can use this product to configure this product cart widget, which gives us an onPressed callback that we then use to push a new material page route with this product screen widget configured with the product ID. So really what we are doing here is to start from a list of products that we can show inside this grid of items. And then for each item, we can get the product by index inside the item builder. And then we get the ID for that product and pass it to the product screen widget. And then inside that widget, we find the corresponding product once again and use it to render our UI. And one valid observation that you could make at this point is this. Why should we bother passing the product ID as an argument to the product screen widget when we could pass the product object instead? Since we already have it, and this is what the product screen needs after all. And in general, this is a valid argument. However, one of the goals of routing on the web is to be able to navigate to a product page given a unique URL that points to that page. And this is only possible and easy to do if we specify the product ID as part of the URL, because GoRouter will then be able to parse this URL, extract the product ID, and then use it to show the correct product page. Long story short, this code is already configured to work with the product ID that we need, and we just need to convert it to use the GoRouter APIs. So let's get back to our approuter.dart file, and inside this enumeration, we can add a new route called product. And then if we scroll down inside our GoRouter, we can add a new subroute in here. And then we can specify the path, and we are going to type product/:ID. And this syntax is used to tell GoRouter that this ID is a dynamic router parameter that is passed as an argument from the outside. And then we can add the name, which will be upproute.product.name, along with a builder argument, which gives us the context and state arguments as usual. And this time we're going to open some curly braces, and inside we can type final product ID equal to state dot. And as you can see, VS Code gives us a list of all the properties of this state object. And the one that we want is called params. And as you can see, params is a map of string key value pairs. And this means that we can obtain the product ID by passing ID as a subscript, along with an assertion operator at the end. And as we will see, as long as we always pass an ID when navigate to this route, then this value will never be null, and that's why it's safe to use the assertion operator. And once we have this, we can just return a product screen passing the product ID as an argument. And of course, we need to import this. And now that this is in place, we can get back to the products grid widget. And over here, we can update this callback by deleting this code, and instead we can type context.goNamed, and we can pass upproute.product.name as an argument. And of course, we need to import GoRouter as well as our approuter file. And then we want to pass a params argument, which needs to be a map. So here we can use a map literal and pass the ID to be equal to product.id, like this. And now that this is in place, we can save and hot reload to test our code. And as you can see, every time we navigate to one of these pages, then the corresponding ID is set in the URL. And you will see that we have different IDs for different pages. And just to be clear, all these IDs come from this global k-test_products variable. And if we go to the definition of this variable, we find a list with all the products, with the first one that starts with ID equal to 1, all the way to the bottom where the last ID is 14. Okay, so this wraps up our lesson about routing with parameters. And what we have learned is that GoRouter gives us the ability to pass some parameters as a map of key value pairs when we navigate to a new route. And in the route definition, we can retrieve these parameters and use them to configure our widget. And when we configure things this way, then the ID will become part of the URL, following the format that we have specified in the path argument. And before we continue, I want to quickly talk about this state object that we have used to extract the product ID. And if we open the GoRouter documentation, we can find this page about declarative routing. And if we scroll down, we can find this section about the router state. And this includes this table with a good summary of all the properties that we can find inside the state object. And I recommend that you spend some time getting familiar with them, because these properties give us a common vocabulary for talking about routes, and it is useful to understand the difference between the location, the name, and the path of a given route. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson, where we will talk about error handling. In this lesson, we are going to talk about error handling, and at this stage you may wonder what happens if we use a URL with an ID that doesn't exist. For example, here we could use 100, which is definitely not a valid ID. And as you can see, if we try to load this, we get this exception with a red up bar. And to understand why this happens, we can open the product screen. And as we can see here, we are trying to find a matching product ID using this first where method, and this always throws an exception if a match can't be found. And this will propagate the exception all the way to our main.dart file, where we have this custom error handling code that shows a red up bar with the error details inside a text widget. So it looks like at this stage we are definitely not handling this kind of error gracefully. But to be fair, this is one of many places in the app where we are just using some test data. And in fact, I've left this to do here, saying that we should load this from the data source rather than using a hard-coded product list. And this is something that we will implement properly later on. So for now, we're just going to leave this code as it is for this specific page, because we will have to change this logic later anyway. However, we should ask ourselves what we should do if we enter any kind of unsupported URL in the address bar and how to handle it. And since we are not handling this ourselves, what happens if we do this now? For example, by typing something like /ABC, which is a path that doesn't exist. And as it turns out, we end up with this page not found screen, with an exception about no routes for the given location. However, if we want, we can customize this page by going back to our app router, and then we can scroll to the bottom, and here we can choose to add an error builder, which is a closure that gives us a context and a state argument as usual. And we can use this to return a const not found screen, which is a widget that we need to import. And this widget is located inside this not found folder over here. And if we save our router code now, and then we try to load this page again, then we get this slightly different UI with a text and a button that we can use to go back home. However, if we click on this button, then nothing happens. And that's because the callback of this button assumes that we are still using Navigator 1.0. And instead, we should now use the GoRouter API to navigate to the home page instead. In other words, we should go to the definition of the not found screen, which I created over here. And here we can find that it uses this empty placeholder widget as the body of the scaffold. So we should open this widget as well. And if we scroll down, we should locate this primary button with an unpressed callback. And here we should replace all this code that uses the Navigator 1.0 API. And instead we can type context.goNamed with approute.home.name as an argument. And of course we need to import both GoRouter and our approuter.dart file. And if we hot reload now, we should now be able to click on this button and be taken back to the home page. And this is a much better experience for the user. In summary, in this lesson we have learned how to handle errors that arise if we try to open a URL that is not recognized. And we have seen that GoRouter already has an error screen that is used by default, but if we want, we can provide our own custom error builder instead. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. Now that we have converted some of the navigation code to use GoRouter, I want to point out one subtle bug that we have introduced when we made our changes. And to show you what that is, I can open the debug console, and then I can select any of these products on the product page. And as you can see, this takes us to this route. And from here, I could choose to open the shopping cart, which takes us to this route with location/cart. However, if I now press the close button, I can see that I'm now back to the products list, which is not the route that I came from. Because before opening the shopping cart, I was on this product page. So I would expect that if I open the shopping cart and close it again, I should return to the same page where I came from. But right now, this is not what is happening, and I end up on the home page instead. And to understand why this is happening, we can open the shopping cart icon file. And in here, we can scroll down and find this call to context.goNamed with approute.cart.name. And what happens when we call go or go named is that GoRouter will take us to the route that we have specified by working out the target location from the route hierarchy that we have encoded in the GoRouter declaration. And to show you what I mean, let's go back to the approuter file. And as you can see, here we have defined this cart route. And this is not a subroute of the product route, but instead it's a subroute of the home route, which is the root of all routes. And as we can see from the debug console, if we navigate to the product screen, and then we go to the cart from there, then the old route is discarded from the navigation stack. And in some cases, this is what we want, because our intent is to go from whichever route we are on to a completely different route that lives somewhere else in the route hierarchy. And in this kind of scenario, it's okay to use go or go named. But sometimes what we want instead is to just push a new route on top of the current one. And if that is what we want to do, then we should use push or push named instead, which behave much like the corresponding APIs from Navigator 1.0. So the bottom line of this is that we want to call context.pushNamed in this case. And if we save and hot reload, we can test this again. So let's start from the home page, and this time we should be able to select a new product and then open the shopping cart. And if we dismiss this page, we get back to the product page itself. Because all we are doing now is to push a new route on top of the existing one rather than going to it. And of course, we have the same problem if we try to go to the orders page or the account page from the product page, because this will also take us back to the home page if we dismiss them. And the way to fix this behavior is the same. And that is to open the home app bar file. And here we should replace all these calls with context.pushNamed, like this. And I should also remember to do the same inside the More menu button and scroll to the bottom. And again, here I should replace this with pushNamed, like this. And now we should be able to save these files. And then from here, open the orders page. And if we dismiss it, we can see that we get back to the same page. And the same happens if we do this from the account page. And to summarize, let me show you a diagram that explains the difference between go and push. So what we have here at the top is a representation of the navigation stack that we have when we are on the product page. And you can think of Go as a way to jump from any given route to any other route inside the GoRouter hierarchy. And this will modify the underlying navigation stack if the new route is not a subroute of the old one. On the other hand, push is more in line with what Navigator 1.0 does and will always push the destination route on top of the existing navigation stack. And depending on how you have structured your route hierarchy, in some cases, go and push might have the same effect. But as we have seen in this example, there are cases where you need to think carefully about which one you should use. And if you open the official documentation and go to this page about navigation, then you can scroll down and find this section about pushing pages, which explains the difference between go and push in more detail. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to complete our migration from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter. And as it stands, we have already created these 6 routes along with all their details inside our GoRouter object. But there are still a couple of pages in our app that use Navigator 1.0. And these are this page to leave a review. And also this other page which starts the checkout process by asking the user to create an account. So let's go ahead and add these routes to GoRouter as well. And to start off, we can focus on the route for leaving a review, which is a route that we can only access from the product page. So let's add this as a new value to our enumeration. And then we can scroll down to find our product route. And here we can add a list of routes. And inside it, we can copy and paste one of the existing routes. For example, we can choose this route that is used to navigate to the shopping cart. And we can copy all this code and paste it in here. And then we need to modify all these arguments. For example, for the path, we can type review, and then the name should be upRoute.leaveReview.name. And inside the page builder, we want to replace this shopping cart screen with leave review screen, and we want to import it as well. And as we can see, we now have an error because this screen takes a product ID as an argument. And this means that we need to get the product ID from the state params like we have done over here. So let's modify this code by replacing this arrow notation with some curly braces. And then inside it, we can return the material page like this. And then we can copy this line from here and paste it in here to retrieve the product ID. And finally, we can pass this as an argument to the leave review screen widget. And we should also remove this const keyword to make the compiler happy. Next, we need to find the code that is used to navigate to this screen. And we can do this by opening the Finder and look for a file called leave review action. And once we open this, we can scroll down to the build method. And here we can find the old code that uses the Navigator API. And we can delete this code and we can replace it with context.goNamed, passing upRoute.leaveReview.name as an argument. And of course, we need to import goRouter as well as upRouter.dart. And like we have done before, we need to pass a params argument which takes a map literal with the product ID inside it. And we can see that this is valid code because this product ID was passed as an argument to our widget. So at this stage, we can save and hot reload. And we can test the new code by pressing this button to leave a review. And we can see that the URL at the top is updated as expected. And if we open the debug console, we can also see that we have navigated to the correct location. So this part is done, and we now have only one thing left to do. And that is to go back to the upRouter file and scroll to the top. And over here, we can add a checkout route that we will navigate to when we are in the shopping cart and we press this checkout button. So let's add a new route for this by scrolling down and finding the cart route over here. And like we did before, here we can add a list of routes, which initially will be an empty list. And then inside it, we need to put a new route, which will represent the checkout page. So let's copy all these lines and paste them in here and also add a closing bracket at the end. And then we can update these arguments. So this path will be checkout like this. And this name will be upRoutes.checkout like this. And finally, we need to update this child widget, which in this case should become a checkout screen. And of course, we need to import this as well. Then we can save this file. And finally, we can go to the definition of the shopping cart screen, because this is the widget from where we navigate to the checkout page. And in here, we can scroll down and find the old Navigator 1.0 code, and we can delete it. And instead, we can type context.goName and pass upRoute.checkout.name as an argument. And as usual, we need to import goRouter.dart and upRouter.dart. And now we are ready to test this. So we can save our file. And to test this properly, we can start from the product list and select any product. And then from here, we can open the cart screen. And if we click on checkout, we can see that we are now taken to the registration screen, which is how things are intended to work, because the checkout screen itself contains this registration screen. And if we close this and get back to the shopping cart and close this again, we can see that we are back to the product list and not the product page, which is where we came from. And can you think of what is the reason for this? Well, once again, we can see that this line of code goes to the checkout page from the shopping cart screen. And by going to that page, we lose track of the product page, which is where we originally came from. So if our intent is to be able to push one or more routes and always be able to come back to where we came from, then we should use push named in this case as well. So let's save this and do one more test. And now we should be able to open the product page and then select the cart screen and go to checkout. And then we can close this and close again. And as we can see, we are back to where we came from. So once again, this is a little reminder about the difference between go and push. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to talk about how to pop routes with GoRouter. And if you worked with Navigator 1.0 before, you'll know that if you have more than one route in your navigation stack, you can always call navigator of context.pop, and this will remove the current route and go back to the previous one. And if you want, you're free to use the GoRouter equivalent of navigator.pop by simply calling context.pop, and this will work exactly in the same way. However, one thing to keep in mind is that navigator.pop gives you the ability to return a value, and this is not something that you can do with GoRouter. And if you want to learn more about this, I recommend that you open the GoRouter documentation, and here you can find this page about user input forms. And this explains in details the reasons why you may want to push a route using await and collect a return value at the end, which you can use to set some state. And this page also explains why this use case is not supported by GoRouter and what you can do instead. So what does this all mean for us? Well, if we go back to our project and then we do a project-wide search for .pop, we'll find all the instances where we call navigator or context.pop in our project. And in some of these cases, we just call navigator or context.pop without a return value, such as in this example in the email and password signing page. But in other cases, we do use a return value, such as in this example where we show a dialog and we want to return a value of true if we select the default button or false if we select the cancel button. And an example where we call this method is the account screen that we can access over here. And this has a logout button that only shows this not implemented dialog for now. And the code for this lives inside the onPressed callback of this button. But if we want, we can dismiss this and remove this line, and we can uncomment all these lines instead. And as we can see here, we call show alert dialog and wait for the result. And then if this value is true, then we call navigator of context.pop to dismiss this page. And to show you how this works, I can save and hot reload. And now if I click on the logout button, then I get this dialog with two options. And if we select cancel, then the dialog is dismissed and we remain on the account page. But if we select logout, then the account page is dismissed as well. And this is because we're getting the logout return value from this call. And then we only pop the current route if logout is true. In summary, the takeaway is that if we want to pop a route without returning a value, we can just call navigator of context.pop or context.pop using the GoRouter API, and these will work exactly in the same way. But if we do want to return a value, then we can only do so with navigator of context.pop with value. And once again, this page on the GoRouter documentation covers all the details. But as far as we are concerned, there isn't really anything that we need to change in our code in this regard, and I only wanted to cover this topic to give you a better overview. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. In this lesson, I want to talk about nested navigation, which is a use case that is described in this section about advanced routing in the GoRouter documentation. And the main idea with nested navigation is that sometimes you have a widget such as a tab bar view with two or more tabs that you can select to show different content pages. And in this use case, you may want the URL in the address bar to update when any tab is selected, like it is shown in this example. And this use case doesn't only apply to tab bar, but also to bottom navigation or even page view, because all these widgets have one thing in common, and that is that they have a controller that can be used to retrieve and update the currently selected page programmatically. And this page in the GoRouter documentation builds upon this and shows us how we can keep the browser URL in sync with the selected page when we do nested navigation. And once again, this is a nice feature to have if we have multiple tabs that the user can select to show different pages. And as far as our e-commerce app goes, we can ask ourselves if this is also something that we want to support. And one place where we could consider this feature is the checkout page that we can reach from the shopping cart. And the way this works is that if we click on the checkout button, then we are taken to this registration page. And here we can enter any test email and password. And if we pay attention, we can click on create an account and see that this payment page slides in from the right. And this is not done with a standard navigation based on routes, but instead it is done with a page view and a page controller instead. And if you want to see how this all works in the code, you can open the checkout screen from here. And here you will find this checkout screen widget. And if you scroll down to the state subclass, you can see that we are declaring a page controller along with this subroute, which is first initialized as checkout subroute.register. And down here we have this callback handler called onSignedIn. And what we do here is to update the state to a different subroute. And we also call controller.animateToPage with the index of the subroute. And if we scroll down to the build method, we can see how the entire UI is put together. And the most important thing is this page view, which takes the controller that we have declared above as an input. And this page view has two children pages called email, password, sign-in content, and payment page. And once again, when we begin the checkout flow, we are taken to this register page, which is represented by the email, password, sign-in content widget. And when we create an account, then this callback is called. And as we have seen, we can use this to animate to the next page. But if you pay attention at the address bar, you will see that the URL doesn't change when we go from the registration to the payment page. And that's because we have not added the GoRouter code that we will need to enable this. But the question is, do we even want to change the URL when we transition between these pages? And if you remember, the GoRouter documentation about nested navigation presents this as a valid use case when the user can select different tabs by clicking on them. But in our case, the user should not be allowed to choose which page to see. And instead, the only way to go from the registration page to the payment page is by entering an email and password and clicking on this button. And only after validating the email and password, which is something that we will implement later on, we should be able to go to the payment page. So the point that I'm trying to make is that all the screens in the checkout flows represent a journey that the user has to take. And the logic for going from one screen to the next have to do with data validation and application state. And we should not be allowed to switch between screens just by changing the URL in the address bar. So from this point of view, I think it makes more sense to refer to all the screens in the checkout flow as a single route called checkout. And we don't need to support nested navigation with GoRouter in this case. But of course, there are cases where it makes sense to support nested navigation as explained here. And if you have this kind of requirement in your apps, then you can follow the instructions and example code in this page to set things up. Okay, so let's continue in the next lesson. We have now reached the end of this section about GoRouter, and along the way we have migrated our entire codebase from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter using declarative routing. And we have learned a lot of things about this package, including how to integrate GoRouter with the Material App Router API, and how to define our entire route hierarchy declaratively inside the GoRouter object, and how to use the various GoRoute parameters such as path, name, and builder, as well as how to work with dynamic parameters, and how to use the GoRouter build extension to navigate to our widget. And we have also covered the difference between Go and Push. And with that said, we haven't covered everything that there is to know about GoRouter. In fact, there are still some advanced topics that we need to cover with regards to navigation and routing. And these include redirection, as well as some of the topics covered in the advanced section. And we also haven't talked about how to test our routing code. And before we can tackle these topics, we need to make some more progress in other parts of the app, in particular with regards to app architecture and state management, which is what we will cover in the upcoming sections. But what we have already covered up to this point should give you enough confidence to use GoRouter in your own apps. And you can use the official documentation as a reference. And also check the notes at the end of this section for some additional resources. And before we continue, there is one tiny change that I want to make, and that is to go back to our app router file and disable the debug log diagnostics flag, because we have now verified that our routing code works correctly, and we don't want our console logs to be too chatty about it going forward. In any case, now that we have reached the end of this section, you can look at the resources in this lesson where you'll find an updated code snapshot that you can use as a starting point as we go forward. And before we move on, I'd like to give you an exercise, and that is to grab the starter project that I shared at the beginning of this section and see if you can repeat all the steps that we have covered by migrating the code from Navigator 1.0 to GoRouter. And you can try to do this independently without watching the videos. And I think this will help you to really understand how to work with GoRouter. Alright, so let's continue on the next section where we will discuss the very exciting topic of app architecture.